All right, well, let's get back to our outline we were looking at yesterday. We talked about what the occasion of the letter from, or the report from Chloe's people, the letter that the Corinthians had written, and then the other reports that Paul had learned. The case of incest, the lawsuits, the factions at the Lord's Supper, etc. And then I mentioned the larger issue, the underlying issue that appears to be happening there, this a conflict between Paul and the church, negative attitudes of the church towards Paul. And then we concluded yesterday with a threefold purpose in Paul's writing: to address the problems in the church, to respond to the Corinthians' letter, and then to inform them of his travel plans. I want to say something about, because behind these problems, we can see some of the antagonists that Paul is addressing. And so I put on your outline there the opponents. In contrast to Paul's letter to the Galatians, or even to Corinthians, the opponents that Paul faces in the book, in this letter, are not outside agitators who came in from the outside to infect the church, to spread false teaching. But these were people who emerged from within the church. And it does appear that there's a certain group within the church that opposed Paul, were calling his apostleship into question, calling his authority into question. And those few were beginning to influence the whole. And I've listed for you some thoughts based on the evidence from the letter. So what do we make of these people? Where are they coming from? What angle are they attacking Paul from? So you see there, number one, it's possible that these people looked down on Paul because they thought that they had arrived at a higher level of spirituality than him. They were pneumatikoi. They were the spiritual ones. And you see this sort of arrogance not only toward Paul, but in some of their actions and some of their attitudes in the church. I note there on your outline that they're probably influenced by Greek ideas of Sophia, or divine wisdom, which for many was the goal of life, to attain to this esoteric wisdom. And of course, in the first few chapters, which we're going to look at later, Paul addresses those who apparently think that they are wise. Chapter 1, verse 20, Paul will say, where is the one who was wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Remember, we talked about those sophists, those rhetoricians there. You see Paul alluding there. Chapter 2, verse 6, yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, although not a wisdom of this age. So Paul is going to rework their idea of wisdom. What really is wisdom? They've got a view of wisdom. Paul is going to alter that. So again, many are apparently beginning to think of their faith in terms of this Sophia, or wisdom. So if yes, we know Christ, He is our Messiah, but He becomes this pathway towards attaining to wisdom. And so you see what's happening. The gospel is being recast. The gospel is being Hellenized. It's being reworked and beginning to be thought of in Greek terms. That's one of the things Paul is going to be addressing. Secondly, this spirituality was also related to their experience of the Holy Spirit, especially their experience of speaking in tongues. We're going to see this especially in chapter 14, where Paul weighs in on their experience of speaking in tongues. He's going to mention his own experience of speaking in tongues, but then, of course, he's going to place that in perspective and emphasizing the importance of building each other up. We'll look at that in depth. Letter C, we see this Hellenism also in the apparent dualism that's affecting their theology. So it does appear some of them are denigrating the material world. Some are forbidding marriage. Some are advocating asceticism. So abstaining, even in marriage, abstaining from sexual relations. Some are denying the resurrection, chapter 15. And so you can see, you can see how these interact. If they've already arrived at this sort of exalted spirituality, this exalted spiritual state, then there's no need for the resurrection. They already are now what they are destined to be, except for their body, which they're going to lose. Now, on the other hand, this cuts in different ways. On the other hand, this also led some to immorality. We're going to see in chapter 6, some people in the church were visiting prostitutes, which always strikes me. It's like, you think about problems in your church, you probably don't have a lot of guys going to prostitutes. You just think, Paul, my goodness, what he had to deal with. But some are visiting prostitutes and apparently saw nothing wrong with this. Why? Because it only involved their body. They considered themselves to be spiritual ones, and so what they did with their body was insignificant. Much of this has been put under the label of what we call over-realized eschatology. Do you remember the New Testament's eschatological framework? The already and the not yet. You familiar with that, right? Well, just as a reminder, the Jewish conception of time and the Jewish conception of history, history was divided into two ages. You had the present evil age and the age to come. And what's the transition point between the present evil age and the age to come in the Jewish mindset? Yes, the coming of the Messiah. Now, we should be aware, not all Jews were waiting on a Messiah. There were many different messianic expectations. Some Jews were expecting God to just intervene directly. Some Jews felt, especially the Sadducees would have felt, that the messianic, that there was no Messiah. The Messiah was an ideal, and it was brought into being by the Hasmonean dynasty. So when Jews won their independence from the Greeks, they set up the Hasmonean dynasty. The Messianic age had begun then, and then Jewish life then was just sort of an outworking of that. Some were looking for a military Messiah. I think that was perhaps the most common, a son of David who would come and judge the wicked and vindicate the righteous and overthrow the oppressors. The boot of Rome that was on the neck, they would cast that off and they would once again gain their independence, and God's promises to Israel would be fulfilled. But yes, this is the moment, what the Old Testament calls the day of the Lord, right? Remember that from your prophets course? Yom Yahweh. Yom Yahweh, the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is going to come. God is going to intervene. God is going to vindicate the righteous, fulfill his promises to Israel, overthrow the oppressors, and usher in the age to come. Remember all that? All right, what happened when Jesus came? Jesus introduced an alteration of that. What was that alteration? Well, when Jesus came, of course, the Messiah had arrived, and he introduces, so you've got the present evil age. And so he introduces the age to come. In other words, as the writer of Hebrews says it, the powers of the age to come have invaded this present evil age. And so with Christ, yes, the kingdom has come. With Pentecost in particular, not just the cross, but also Acts chapter 2, with Pentecost, God's promises to his people are fulfilled in part. God is acting to restore Israel. In Acts chapter 1, the disciples say, is it now that you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And we sort of laugh at that and say, oh, they're still thinking about military terms and so forth. Jesus adjusted. It's not for you to know times and seasons. But there's a real sense in which, no, their question was right. Jesus is restoring the kingdom to Israel at Pentecost. Not national Israel, but the new Israel, the reconfigured people of God, the reconstituted people of God. So what happened is the powers of the age to come have indeed invaded this present evil age. And so the modification Jesus introduces is this overlap. We now live in this period of overlap where the big modification was that the present evil age, even though the Messiah has come, the present evil age continues. And that's what people didn't expect. So the present evil age continues, but the age to come has invaded. And this is where we live now. We live in the box. And so the age to come has arrived. Hearts are transformed. People are saved. Marriages can be restored. God will heal physical ailments through a gift of healing by the Spirit at times. Glorious things happen. We know Christ. We have the possession of the Spirit. But the present evil age still continues. And so lives are destroyed by sin. And cancer racks bodies. And marriages at times fall apart. And babies die. And so we live in this box, and we pastor people who live in this box. And this must inform the way we pastor people. Yes, there is hope. Yes, God acts. Yes, we have access to the Spirit. Yes, the gospel is powerful. It's transforming. Yes, however, temptations remain. The flesh remains. Satan continues to seek those whom he may destroy. But when Christ returns the second time at the parousia, what happens? Well, then the age to come is ushered in fullness. Then the present evil age will come to an end, and we will live forever with Christ. All right? That's the eschatological framework of the New Testament. Now, an over-realized eschatology means what? An over-realized, in other words, an overemphasis on the age to come. The age to come has arrived, but if you have an over-realized eschatology, there's an overemphasis on the already and not the not yet. Since the kingdom has come, the blessings of the new age have arrived. So, everyone can be healed. And if you're not healed, it's because you don't have enough faith. Everyone can be wealthy. We're children of the King. So I think a prosperity gospel is another manifestation of this. Now, you can also have an under-realized eschatology where there's an overemphasis on the not yet. Everything is not yet. No one gets healed. Little hope for the progress of the gospel. We're just holding on until Jesus comes back. So life in this world, it's all going to burn. So let's not invest our lives in this age. Let's wait for Jesus to come. Well, in Corinth, there's certain folks who considered themselves these pneumaticoi, these people of the Spirit. They understood their present existence, their present state in strictly spiritual terms. They have already arrived. They're experiencing a kind of ultimate spirituality in which they live above the merely material existence of this present age. So what is Paul going to do in contrast? Paul is going to glory in his weakness that looks poor and unspiritual to them. If you think about 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9, listen to what he says to them. Already you have all you want. Already you have become rich. Without us, you have become kings. And would that you did reign, that we might share the rule with you. For I think that God has exhibited us apostles as last of all, like men sentenced to death. We are fools for Christ's sake. You are wise in Christ. We are weak. You're strong. You're held in honor, and we in disrepute. To this present hour we hunger and thirst. We're poorly dressed and buffeted and homeless, and we labor working with our hands. When reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we endure. When slandered, we entreat. We have become and are still like the scum of the world, the refuse of all things. You see what he's addressing there. This is the kind of opposition he's facing. They think they're kings. They're rich. They've arrived. They're spiritual. Paul says, oh, you're so exalted. Well, let me tell you about myself. We're the scum of the world. So Paul is inverting all of their categories. Again, unlike those opponents we've seen in other letters, the letter to the Galatians in particular, the source of this is Greek thought and paganism mixed in with those Roman values of status and power. Certainly not Judaism. So a very different situation than we see in some of other of Paul's letters. We'll see other things going on as we move forward, but these will be important at key points. Now, finally, letter E on this, even more important, I think, than this Greek mindset. And as I said yesterday, more and more in recent years, scholars have recognized that, is the way in which Corinthian social values have infiltrated the minds and hearts of the Corinthians. So I put on your outline there, in a more general sense, and underlying virtually everything in the letter, is the way in which these values have affected their minds and hearts. So again, these are relatively new. We have to remember who we're talking about. These are relatively new Christians. The church was planted about 4, maybe 5 years prior. And that means they're first generation Christians. They don't have a heritage of faith. Most of them, as we saw, are Gentiles with no Jewish background, with all that brought with it: monotheism and ethical standards, ethical commitments, a view of themselves as God's people over against a pagan secular world. So they didn't have all of that background. They didn't grow up in church. They didn't grow up in a Christian home. This is brand new to them. And so most of the issues that emerge here can be traced to the Corinthians' embrace of the attitudes and values of the culture that they live in. One commentator puts this quite vividly, I think, Lyle Vanderbreck. Each of the community problems Paul needed to address grew out of the Corinthians' inability to let the gospel message fully reshape their Gentile, Greco-Roman lives, whether because they misunderstood that message or because they rejected it outright. They were Hellenists through and through. And this eschatological, cross-centered, body-affirming Jewish sect called Christianity demanded that they enter another theological and ethical world. Do you have that quote? Did I put that on your outline? Good. He puts that so well. They are having to enter a new world. Now, this leads to the final section on your outline, and everything we said yesterday afternoon leading up to this point suggests this. But I want to underline for us just how immensely relevant the Corinthian correspondence, and especially 1 Corinthians, is to our world, to our modern challenges. Now, I'm speaking in particular of Western context, in other words, my own context, which that's the one I'm familiar with. Obviously, this is going to be different from culture to culture. We all face our own challenges. But in settings in particular where Western values have penetrated, and with the internet age and social media and globalization as a whole, these Western values have penetrated far beyond just the Western world. And perhaps you'll see some relevance for yourself as well. I think there's a particular relevance for this letter, regardless of one's cultural setting. And keeping alert to that will help us benefit from the letter as we read. Not just this week, but beyond. So you see there the critical relevance of 1 Corinthians. First of all, there's a cultural similarity. Again, I'm referring to my own setting, but the influence is broader than that, I think. Although separated by 2,000 years, there is a striking similarity between ancient Corinth and my setting and any setting affected by modernity. With regards to America, it's even more the case. Even the case historically. Think about this. Corinth was only remember the history of the city. Corinth was only a few generations removed from its founding by colonists who were often disenfranchised and seeking upward mobility. That's a description of the founding of America. Founded a few hundred years earlier by colonists seeking a new start, often disenfranchised. But it's also the case philosophically. This was a secularized city with church members whose roots are largely pagan. And in the West, in America, in Europe, and again, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on your own setting, but certainly where I live, I grew up in a church. Most people grew up in a church. But now, in America, there's less and less a cultural Christianity and more a cosmopolitan Christianity, where converts are coming from pagan backgrounds with little or no religious training, a high degree of biblical illiteracy. And this is only accelerated, and it's expected to continue. In America, we do many surveys measuring religious affiliation. Typically, the segment that with the fastest growth, at least in my setting, it's not the biggest, but it's the fastest growing, is what people call the nones, N-O-N-E-S. In other words, people with no religious affiliation. That's very similar to what Paul is facing here. Also, so historically, philosophically, also culturally, the individualism that so characterized Corinth is mirrored. Again, I'm speaking about my own setting. You can apply it to yours as appropriate, but it's mirrored in America, where really individualism and freedom and autonomy, those are the preeminent values. It's all about autonomy. No one tells me what to do. You don't even tell me what gender I am. Even the physical world doesn't tell me what gender I am. People are governed by an autonomous self. Expressive individualism, as it's been called. So the culture being addressed here is very much like my own, and perhaps you'll see some similarities with yours as well. In addition, these same, and again, we're talking about the relevance to this for us, the same cultural pressures exerted themselves on the church. So there are valuable lessons here to learn about guarding against cultural accommodation. And in Corinth, there was a clear accommodation of the gospel to culture. In other words, the gospel was being conceived of in terms consistent with cultural standards and cultural values. There's no reference in this letter to persecution or alienation. This is not 1 Thessalonians or 1 Peter. This is a church, just take this with you, this is a church very much at home in its culture. That's why I love this book. The church is at home. It's not being persecuted. They're comfortable. And so it provides us, I think, with valuable insight. This leads to a second benefit. The book gives a wonderful model of pastoral discernment. Pastoral discernment. Again, many, if not most, of the problems Paul addresses here were motivated by social and cultural factors. In many cases, the problems emerged not not by like heresies coming in out of nowhere. The problems emerge simply from the Corinthians' tendency to think and act in ways entirely normal in a Greco-Roman city. So they're just living life the way you live life in Corinth. That's where so many of the problems come. Tell me that's not relevant for Christians anywhere. It's so easy for us to, yes, we're believers, but we live our lives like our neighbors. We embrace the values that our culture holds in high esteem. So things like taking others to court. We'll talk about what was going on there. Accepting invitations to banquets in pagan temples. And so in many cases, the problems Paul addresses are not explicitly theological. In other words, they're not struggling with false ideas. They're not twisting Christology or things like that. But Paul's genius here, and this is the great example for us, his genius here is how he nevertheless diagnoses these problems, which are not on the surface theological, but he diagnoses them in theological terms. So he exposes the theological issues at stake. He holds these issues up to the light of the gospel. And so over and over, he's going to call the Corinthians to scrutinize their cultural practices, to rethink their inherited norms. That is a key role of the pastor. And that requires discernment. That's often complex because not everything needs to be changed. For example, we'll see in chapter 7, marriage to a non-Christian spouse was not to be abandoned, as some thought, but it was to be honored. In other words, becoming a Christian didn't release you from those commitments. So not everything needs to be changed, but many things need to be rethought. And in my own setting, and perhaps yours as well, in other ways maybe, but the gospel is not always under direct attack. Increasingly it is, but often and more subtly, it's not so much that the gospel is attacked, but the gospel is accommodated to our culture. So the gospel is accommodated to, for instance, a psychologized, therapeutic mindset, or to worldly measures of success. So much of the Christian world, you see, it's just, it adopts the world's standards of value, of prominence, of success, rather than defining success from a biblical worldview. The gospel is accommodated to materialistic values and ambitions and cravings, to a subjective emotional experientialism. Any of these sound familiar? I'm sure they do. It's actually frightening how relevant some of the specific solutions that Paul gives to the situation at Corinth are to our own day, especially, I think, of the charismatic movement in my setting. Perhaps, as I've learned more about your setting, perhaps in the Protestant church, the Pente church, you could teach me about that. But think about this, the centrality of the cross against human wisdom. Humility and suffering over against triumphalism. The value of edification of believers in worship rather than the exaltation of personal, emotional experience. A Christian ethic that derives from our theology rather than an experiential Christianity that disregards ethics. That's seen in Corinth in their sexual immorality. And it's all too often the case today. A super spirituality that will sing and speak in tongues, but will lose categories of holiness and ethics as long as there is experience. So this letter is a brilliant model of theological reflection, applying discernment to cultural issues in pastoral situations, applying theology, especially applying the cross to practical circumstances of life. That's what we see in this letter. Related to this, letter C, is a gospel centrality. Much of the theological reflection in this letter that Paul engages in involves the gospel. Time and again, Paul views issues and circumstances through the prism of the gospel. He exposes these situations to the light of the gospel. I know this is something you've been immersed in here in the Pastor's College. Our students back home are as well. But what I want to note here is what's especially important is just how the gospel is formulated in 1 Corinthians. So it's not simply justification. In other words, battle condemnation by resting in what Christ has done for you. That's absolutely true. That's absolutely vital. That's absolutely glorious. But it's not, and it's what Paul does over and over again in other letters. It's not what he does so much here. In fact, interestingly, although Paul emphasizes the cross, I preach Christ and Him crucified. Chapter 2, chapter 15, I delivered to you as what was of first importance, that Christ died for our sins. He was raised, right? So we have Christ crucified prominent in this book. However, in this letter, there's not a heavy emphasis. There's not a detailed treatment on the atoning aspects of the gospel. Although it's certainly there and it's everywhere implied. What's especially emphasized in this letter are the eschatological effects of the gospel. So it broadens our gospel centrality. So Christ's work has not only made us new people, Christ's work has not only purchased forgiveness, although, yes, it has gloriously done that. Christ's work has also initiated a new apocalyptic age. The cross has ushered in new realities, a whole new existence for Christians. So because of the gospel, there's a whole new cosmic situation which informs who we are and how we are to live. And I just gave you some examples here on your outline. So the cross is going to redefine cultural definitions such as status and wisdom, chapter 1. The cross redefines how we view leadership, chapter 3. Servants who face an eschatological assessment. The cross redefines how we view the church. It's the temple of the Holy Spirit. The cross redefines how we view ministry. Chapter 4, suffering according to the pattern of Christ. The cross redefines how we view disputes. It's fascinating what Paul says to them. Don't you know you're going to judge angels? Oh, okay. You see what he's doing? He's applying the gospel. Where's justification? He's not talking about justification. He's talking about the new identity of Christians as those who belong to the age to come. Cross redefines how we view marriage. This is going to be powerful. Marriage is glorious. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, Ephesians chapter 5. Right? What's he going to say in chapter 7 of this letter? Well, we live in a certain sense as if not. In other words, marriage is not the ultimate category because of the cross. It's glorious, yes. It's part of God's purposes, yes. But it's not ultimate. The cross redefines how we view spiritual experiences. Chapter 13. Now, he's going to commend spiritual gifts. He's going to teach on spiritual gifts. But in chapter 13, what does he say? Powerful encounters with God, which are real and which are glorious, but they're passing away. Something better's coming. See, the cross redefines everything. It redefines how we view death. Chapter 15. It's not the ultimate because resurrection is coming. Death does not have the final word. So I just love what he does. And he's taught me so much. Over and over, the new eschatological existence of the Christian completely transforms how we view life down to its most mundane details. That's what we see in this letter. Another benefit of the book, especially important for pastors, letter D, is its ecclesiological focus. In 1 Corinthians, Paul is not just concerned with individual edification. One of his key tasks with this church is community formation. So he's not just addressing individuals, he's caring for and nurturing a community of believers joined together by the Spirit, members of one another, chapter 12, responsible for one another. My actions don't only affect me, they affect you, chapter 5. So throughout this letter, Paul's constant goal is to call the Corinthians to understand their corporate existence as the church. So in chapter 3, he's going to modify their view of leaders, not as heroes, not as people they are to worship and identify with. No, they are leaders who build and care for the church, and they are accountable for this. Chapter 5, he's going to correct the church strongly for not taking heed of its own morality. Chapter 6, he's going to attack lawsuits by appealing to their corporate identity as an eschatological community. So throughout this letter, Paul labors to build into the Corinthians a corporate identity in the midst of a pagan world. It's a big part of what pastors do. So he has to, as one commentator put it, he has to convert their imagination to see the world with new eyes in light of the gospel. And it's precisely the task we have as pastors in building the church. One of the ways that he's going to do this, one of his strategies in helping the Corinthians do this, is to help them envision themselves as, again, these are former pagans. But what he's going to help them do is envision themselves as part of the Bible's storyline. He's going to take these former pagans and say, you are heirs of Israel's story. We're going to see this in chapter 10 when he references Israel's idolatry in judgment in the wilderness. And what is he going to say to them? These things happened to our fathers. Yes, our fathers. Not just me, Paul the Pharisee, but all of you. We're all part of their story. He says these are examples for us. So don't be idolaters. Don't act immorally. Don't test the Lord. Don't grumble. These things happened to them as an example, Paul says. They were written for our instruction, and upon whom the end of the ages has come. So what is he saying? You, Corinthians, you're part of this. You former pagans, you're participants in Israel's history. You've been written into this story. You play a part in the climax of the story. So let's avoid their mistakes. You see what he's doing? He's just totally renovating their heritage, their identity, their understanding of who they are. One other aspect of this ecclesiological focus that's relevant for us in every church, and that's this. Paul is dealing with folks along a spectrum of social and economic classes. And I mentioned this yesterday, but in Sovereign Grace and my presence here with you men just reinforces it vividly for me. But in Sovereign Grace, this is becoming more and more the case as our diversity increases. Increasingly, as we plant churches and join with global partners. I alluded to this yesterday, but currently in Sovereign Grace, we have, I think this number is right, I think it's current, 75 churches in different parts of the world asking to be adopted into our family. And we believe that we'll adopt about 60 of those churches in the next 2 to 3 years. 60 churches in the next 2 or 3 years in different parts of the world. Also, in the next 2 years alone, we'll have around, I think, 14 churches planted. 9 of those outside of the United States. And of the 5 in the States, 2 of those are non-English speaking churches. One is a Hispanic speaking church in the United States. One's a Chinese speaking church in the United States. That's glorious. And that will produce challenges. Wonderful challenges that increasing diversity naturally brings. In this letter, Paul deals with these challenges and deals with these tensions brilliantly. And his use of the gospel to bridge these differences becomes a compelling model for us as well. This leads to a final aspect of the book's relevance for us, the model of ministry it provides. And as I mentioned yesterday again, that I think these letters, the Corinthian correspondence, contain, in my mind, the most relevant, the most compelling, the most important material on Christian leadership than any other book of the Bible. These books essentially take the teaching of Jesus on humility and servanthood, and then apply them to and display them in the life and ministry of a Christian pastor. So it's from 1 Corinthians, and we were alluding to this yesterday, it's from 1 Corinthians that we derive the notion of a cross-dominated preaching over against that which the world views as wise or as impressive, or that gets the most social media views. It's in 1 Corinthians that we see the Christian leader repudiating worldly methods of ministry. I read an article not long ago. It was an expose of a well-known Christian preacher in New York City. And this was a secular journalist just getting in behind the scenes and writing their observations. And they were speaking about the clothes that this pastor wore, the finest clothes, designer clothes. He had someone helping him dress. They had a green room that was set apart, and this man knew many celebrities, and they were naming professional basketball players and singers and so forth, and they would be escorted through the crowd, and they would go back to the green room and feast. So it just makes you cringe. It was just no different than something we would see in our culture. Here we see the Christian leader saying things not give me the nicest car, give me the nicest clothes, honor me as a leader. No, we have become the scum of the world. It's in this letter that we see leaders not as heroes, just servants. Just servants, instruments God uses. We see leaders, chapter 3, eschatologically accountable for how they build. We see leaders are to live not exalted lives, not privileged lives, but cruciform lives. Lives that not only proclaim the cross, but lives that are shaped by the cross. We'll delve into all of that. Paul's letters to Timothy and Titus are traditionally called the pastoral epistles, but a case could be made that in the Corinthian correspondence we have the pastoral epistles par excellence, and they're going to help us immensely. Okay? Any thoughts? Any questions? That's a great question, which gets into a larger pastoral responsibility of, okay, how do you lead your church through books of the Bible? What considerations do you use? I know of one well-known pastor, wonderful man. You would know his name. He has a much more mechanical way of doing it. He goes New Testament, Old Testament, New Testament, Old Testament, New Testament, Old Testament. His impulse behind that is, well, I just want to make sure I'm exposing people to all parts of the Bible. I don't approach it that mechanically. I think you have to think about, all right, what contribution does a particular letter make, and then what diet does my church need in this season of its life? And so a number of, and again, your congregation is not monolithic. Not everyone is in the same place in life. They're not experiencing the same certain things. But you're not simply preaching to individuals, though. When you're preaching, you're leading a church through your preaching. And so I think. So, for instance, in a church plant, one thing you need to realize if you're planting a church is the people that you plant with. This is particularly the case in our setting. The people that you plant with may not be the people who are with you in 2 years. I was talking to a guy, it was a couple of years ago, and he was saying, well, I'm planting a church, and I was thinking about my first series kind of being through, kind of going almost like through a new members thing. This is what our church is about. And I cautioned him about that. I said, I don't know that I would do that. I think I would wait before you're leading a church through that kind of material until you know who's really with you. And I think what might be wiser at the beginning is to lay down sort of theological foundations of who we are. And so we began with Paul's letter to the Philippians, which it provided so many opportunities. So obviously, wonderful Christological text where we could preach Christ. Think of Philippians chapter 2. But very much a unity theme and a unity around Christ, which is probably the purpose that Paul wrote that letter, was to, you see it pops up in chapter 4. He urges these two ladies to agree. And earlier in the letter, Paul's going to talk about, I want you to agree. I want you to think the same thing. I want you to be one in heart and one in mind. I want you to have the mind that Jesus has, etc. But it's wonderfully Christ-centered. Paul's heart to know Christ in the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings. To live is Christ and to die is gain. And so it just said, this will enable us to galvanize the church around Christ. If I had to sum it up in a sentence, that's probably why we do that. I know some churches that started with the letter to the Galatians and just laying down the foundations. This is who we are. We're saved by grace. So that aspect of the gospel, I think that can be very wise. Not long after that, we did the Gospel of Mark, because we want to expose people to Jesus. And that's what you do. That's what you're doing, right? I love that you're doing it. I bet you're loving the Gospel of Mark, aren't you? It's like, I liken it to a photo album. You know what a photo album is? You just go through page after page. That's what the book of Mark is. It's just like page after page, photos of Jesus, just pictures of Jesus, views of Jesus over and over and over. What a wonderful thing to lead a church through. And I remember when we did that, at the end, people did not want it to stop. We're just loving these sights of Christ week after week after week. I do think that you do want to give people a diverse diet. You do want to expose them to different things. And so we have also alternated. We have certainly preached from the Old Testament. We don't want to neglect that. We don't feel the need to do it as much as we do the New Testament, because the New Testament is written to people who exist in the same salvation historical era as we do. And so it's more immediately applicable. It gives us the fullness of revelation in Christ. So I don't feel the need to do as much in the Old Testament, although I don't want to neglect the Old Testament. Those are just a few sort of considerations. Now, when it comes to 1 Corinthians, how would this fit in? I think it because in our setting with gospel centrality, especially if you're gathering a new church, I'm probably I probably prefer laying down more traditional, fundamental foundations of gospel centrality, like justification by faith, like the Christ-centeredness that we see in Philippians. I think later on, I think you could do 1 Corinthians earlier on. It's certainly addressing people in our culture, but we're talking about when to do it. Quite honestly, one of the considerations for us is we want to be in a season where, because I've spent so much time in the book, where I'm free to do more of the sermons than I'm able to do now. In our setting, we have C.J. Mahaney's our senior pastor. I'm sort of we team teach, so we have other guys who preach. I'm supposed to preach like once every month, maybe 6 weeks. But it's kind of difficult for me sometimes to do that. But I think one of the key, we've talked about some of the key contributions this letter makes, but one of those is really going to help our people live in a discerning way relative to the culture and how the gospel critiques culture and so forth. So I think it's particularly, Paul is doing it to a fairly new church, but again, he's addressing what's happening there. Our church doesn't resemble the Corinthians at all. So I don't feel the need. So it's not like, Paul did this, 3 years after a church plant. Well, that wasn't his strategy. This came out of his experience with them. But I do think, this is what we're talking about, this letter and how it's going to serve our church. I do think it's becoming more and more relevant, especially for us. I'm not sure what your setting would be, but COVID was massive for us. And not just the disease, but what it did in fragmenting our society, what it did in bringing racial division because of certain events that happened in our culture, and the acceleration of and the aggressiveness of a secular worldview. It used to be 15 years ago to speak in the culture about biblical worldview, to speak about Christ. Many non-believers, the secular media, they might reject that, but you at least had the right to say that. Well, now Christian assertions are now seen as wicked. They're bigotry. They're not inclusive. They're exclusive. Do those terms ring true to you? So now if you stand up for the life of unborn children, you are being oppressive towards women. So now it's not only, oh, we don't agree with you, now it's you're wicked. And so I think more and more this letter is going to serve us in helping us evaluate our culture. So it may come sooner rather than later. The other thing you can do with a book too also is you don't have to think in terms of, okay, I've got to preach through the whole book. You guys were trained in expository preaching, right? Well, expository preaching doesn't necessarily mean we preach. Expository preaching is not limited to we preach through entire books. Now, preaching through entire books, I think, is the best way to lead your church. And I think that is the most faithful application of expository preaching. But you can do a one-off text. You can do a one-off sermon from a letter. I'm going to preach this Sunday from 2 Thessalonians. I'm not in Mark. And it's going to be an expository sermon. So what you could do, Michael, is if you felt, there were people in your church, maybe they're coming from sort of more that background. Well, let's we finished a book. Let's say we've gone through Mark or whatever. Well, now we're going to do a series on 1 Corinthians 12 to 14. Would that be a faithful Could you, well, we haven't looked at it yet, but 1 Corinthians 12 to 14 holds together in this letter as a unit. And so to treat them as a unit is not to distort God's word. In chapter 12, verse 1, Paul is going to say, now concerning spiritual gifts. So he takes up a new issue. So you can be faithful to those chapters even if you sort of extract them from a sermon series on the whole letter. So that might be another strategy. I don't necessarily have to teach through the whole book. I could even teach through, we're going to do a few Sundays on, we want to talk to you about who we are as your pastors. How does God view us? How should you view us as pastors? You could do 1 Corinthians 1 to 4. You could do 1 Corinthians 3 and 4 on just Christian leadership. So how do we view leadership? And that then, there's application to all of us. So you don't only have to think of, I got to do a whole book. Sometimes there's going to be sections of books that can really serve you. It's kind of a mini series in between two series on larger books.